Stork Club, Manhattan, February 18th, 1946, 11:47 p.m. Outside, snow fell on East 53rd Street like white ash, blanketing the sidewalks where black limousines waited with engines running. Inside, on the second-floor VIP room, the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Cuban cigar smoke hung in dense layers beneath the crystal chandeliers. The smell of imported whiskey and expensive cologne mixed with something more primal, more dangerous. The scent of barely contained fear. Lucky Luciano, the man who had unified the Italian mafia into a commission, the criminal genius who had transformed organized crime into a modern corporation, sat at the far end of the mahogany table. He was 48 years old, but the 9 years he'd just spent in Dannemora prison had carved deep lines around his eyes. And he wore a gray Oxford suit tailored on Savile Row, with a white silk handkerchief in his breast pocket. His black hair was slicked back with pomade. In his left hand, a Cohiba cigar. In his right hand, a glass of Johnny Walker Blue Label. Around him, the 6 most dangerous men in New York. Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the underworld, sat to Luciano's right. 55 years old, soft-featured, with the manners of a diplomat. He was the man who had bribed more judges, cops, and politicians than any other criminal in American history. His specialty wasn't violence, but corruption. And in that, he was an unmatched master. Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner, occupied the chair to the left. 43 years old, scars on his face that told stories of knives in dark Brooklyn alleys. Commander of Murder Incorporated, the most efficient contract-killing organization the world had ever seen. They said Anastasia had personally ordered over 500 deaths. His face showed no remorse, only the cold emptiness of a man who had killed so many times he felt nothing anymore. Meyer Lansky, the small Jewish genius who managed the mob's finances like he was J.P. Morgan, sat across from Costello. 44 years old, gold-rimmed glasses, conservative black suit. He didn't look like a gangster. He looked like an accountant. And that's exactly what made him so dangerous. Lansky moved money through accounts in Switzerland, Cuba, and the Bahamas, like a chess grandmaster moving pieces. He was the financial architect of an empire that generated more money than many small countries. And behind them, 3 bodyguards. Sicilians from Brooklyn, men with no last names, no recorded past, no function other than to kill when ordered. One of them, a guy in his 30s with a scar running from ear to ear across his throat, had his hands folded in his lap. But everyone in that room knew he carried a Colt .45 under his left arm and a butcher's knife strapped to his right ankle. And walking toward them through the dim light, leather shoes clicking against the marble floor with each measured, deliberate step, came Bumpy Johnson, alone. No bodyguards, no visible weapons. Nothing but a custom 3-piece navy suit, tailored by a craftsman on 125th Street. A white shirt with no tie because Bumpy never wore ties. A gold watch hanging from a chain on his vest, and a brown leather briefcase he carried in his right hand like a businessman heading to a board meeting. But this wasn't a board meeting. This was the moment when the king of Harlem was about to sit across from the kings of Manhattan, Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Queens, and negotiate the terms of a treaty that would determine who controlled the millions of dollars flowing every week through Harlem's numbers racket. Bumpy Johnson was 40 years old. His face was a mask carved from ebony. Tall, broad-shouldered, with large hands that could strangle a man or count money with the precision of a machine. His hair was cut short, perfectly groomed. His shoes gleamed like black mirrors. There was nothing casual about his appearance. Every detail had been calculated to send a message. I'm as professional as you. as successful as you, as dangerous as you. He reached the table, looked at the chair at the end, the chair that only Luciano should occupy, the chair that symbolized absolute authority. And without saying a word, without asking permission, he pulled it back and sat down. The bodyguards tensed. Hands moved toward guns. The Sicilian with the scar across his throat took a step forward. But Luciano raised one finger. Just one. And everyone froze. Because Luciano knew something his men didn't know yet. This wasn't a man you could intimidate with gestures. This was a man who had survived Dutch Schultz, one of the most violent gangsters in New York. This was a man who controlled Harlem not through terror, but through intelligence. And Luciano respected intelligence more than anything else. Bumpy placed his briefcase on the table. The sound of leather against wood echoed in the silence. He pulled out a cigar from his pocket. A Cuban cigar, the same kind Luciano smoked. He lit it slowly, savoring the ritual. The flame illuminated his face for a second. His eyes, dark and bottomless, showed no fear, only calculation. He took a long drag. The smoke rose toward the ceiling in slow spirals. And only then, after the silence had become so dense it seemed to have weight of its own, after it was clear that Bumpy Johnson wasn't going to rush for anyone, did he speak. "Mr. Luciano, you wanted to talk. So talk." His voice was deep, with an accent that mixed South Carolina drawl with the hard edges of northern Harlem. There was no aggression in his tone, but there was no submission either. It was the voice of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he was worth. And it was in that moment, in that precise second, that the Sicilian with the scar across his throat made the mistake that would change everything. He looked at Bumpy with contempt, with hatred, with the absolute certainty of a man who had grown up in a world where the lines between whites and blacks, between Italians and everyone else, were written in blood. And he spat out one word, a single word that cut through the silence like a rusted blade tearing through flesh. Nigger. He didn't say it as a description. He didn't say it as a neutral fact. He said it as an insult, as a curse, as a declaration that Bumpy Johnson, regardless of his expensive suit, regardless of his control over Harlem, regardless of him sitting at that table, was nothing but a nigger. And in that Sicilian's world, that meant inferior. That meant he didn't deserve respect. That meant he needed to be put in his place. The room froze. Costello closed his eyes like he'd just witnessed a train wreck he knew was coming, but couldn't stop. Lansky stopped breathing. His mind, always calculating, was already adding up the cost of what had just happened. Anastasia showed no emotion, but his hand moved imperceptibly toward his gun. Even Luciano, the man who had survived family wars, betrayals, assassination attempts, a federal conviction, and 9 years in one of America's toughest prisons, knew in that instant that something had changed forever. Because Bumpy Johnson didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't show anger. He didn't reach for a weapon he probably wasn't carrying. He didn't do any of the things an ordinary man would have done in that situation. Instead, with a calm that was more terrifying than any explosion of violence, he opened his briefcase. The sound of the brass clasps opening was like gunshots in the silence. He reached inside. The bodyguards tensed even more. But what Bumpy pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was a photograph, an 8x10 black and white photograph. He slid it across the marble table toward Luciano. The paper whispered against the polished surface. It stopped right in front of Luciano's hands, and when Bumpy spoke, he did so with a cold calm, so absolute that the entire room felt the weight of what was coming. That word, just cost you boys a fortune. But before you understand why that response cleared the streets of Manhattan for months, before you grasp how one man disarmed the most powerful criminal organization in America with a 9-word sentence, you need to know who Bumpy Johnson really was, and why even Lucky Luciano, the godfather of modern organized crime, learned that night that there are men you can't buy, can't threaten, and definitely can't insult without paying the price. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born in South Carolina in October 1905, at a time when being black in the South meant living under the constant terror of Jim Crow. His family moved to Harlem in 1919, when Ellsworth was 14, trying to escape Southern oppression. But what they found in New York wasn't exactly the promised paradise. It was a brutal city where if you were black, you had to fight for every inch of territory, every dollar, every moment of respect. Young Ellsworth was different. While other kids his age solved problems with their fists, he was already thinking 3 steps ahead. He got his nickname Bumpy from a deformation on the back of his head, a protrusion he earned in a street fight when he was 15. But that nickname, which could have been a mockery, became a brand identity. Bumpy. The name resonated through Harlem's streets like distant thunder. By 1930, Bumpy was already working for Stephanie St. Clair, the queen of numbers, the woman who had built the most prosperous illegal lottery racket in Harlem. She taught him something that would change his life. Power doesn't come from how many men you can kill, but from how much information you can control. St. Clair had cops on her payroll, judges who looked the other way, politicians who depended on her campaign contributions, and Bumpy learned every lesson. Then came Dutch Schultz. In 1935, Arthur Dutch Schultz Flegenheimer decided he wanted Harlem's numbers business. See, he was one of the most violent and successful white gangsters in New York, with a reputation for brutality that made even other criminals fear him. Schultz didn't negotiate. He took. And when he set his sights on Harlem, he did it with an army of thugs armed to the teeth. Stephanie St. Clair asked Bumpy for help, and Bumpy, who was only 30 at the time, did something nobody expected. He didn't confront Schultz with violence. He didn't try to match his numbers of armed men. Instead, he studied him like a scientist studies a specimen under a microscope. He discovered Schultz's weak points, his bootlegging operations, his connections to Tammany Hall, his enemies within the Italian mob who saw him as an undisciplined cowboy. And then, with a surgeon's precision, Bumpy began leaking information to the feds, to rivals, to journalists. He orchestrated a pressure campaign that made Schultz paranoid, erratic, dangerous to his own allies. When Schultz was finally murdered in October 1935 at a Newark restaurant, riddled with bullets by mob hitmen, nobody connected the dots back to Bumpy. But on the streets of Harlem, everyone knew the truth. Bumpy Johnson had killed Dutch Schultz without firing a single shot. That was the difference between Bumpy and everyone else. He didn't play the violence game where the strongest man wins. He played the information game where the smartest man always comes out on top. By 1946, 11 years after Schultz's death, Bumpy had consolidated absolute control over Harlem's numbers racket. It was generating between $5 and $8 million a year. He had a network of runners covering every block from 110th Street to 155th. And he paid regular bribes to 67 cops, 12 judges, and half a dozen Tammany Hall politicians. He wasn't just a gangster, he was an institution. But what made him truly unique was how he operated. Other criminals got rich and let their communities rot. Bumpy reinvested. He paid rent for widows who couldn't afford it. He bought books for neighborhood kids. He financed small, legitimate businesses. In Harlem, Bumpy Johnson wasn't seen as a criminal. He was seen as a Robin Hood, a man who took money from vice, from gambling, from inevitable human weaknesses, and redistributed it to people who needed it. And that gave him something no other criminal had: absolute loyalty. In Harlem, people didn't talk to the police about Bumpy. They didn't cooperate with the feds. They didn't testify in court, because Bumpy took care of them, and they took care of him. Now, in February 1946, with World War II freshly ended and lucky Luciano freshly released from federal prison under the condition that he be deported to Italy in 3 weeks, the board was set for the most important game of his life. Luciano wasn't stupid. He knew he couldn't just take Harlem by force. Schultz had tried and failed. So Luciano did something different. He invited Bumpy to a meeting at the Stork Club, the most exclusive nightclub in Manhattan, where Frank Sinatra sang and J. Edgar Hoover drank whiskey, a place where the criminal elite mixed with the social elite. And Luciano reserved the entire VIP room just for this conversation. Because he knew what he was about to negotiate could change the balance of power in New York forever, or unleash a war nobody wanted. When Bumpy arrived that night, he arrived alone. No bodyguards, no visible weapons, just a perfectly tailored suit, a gold watch hanging from his vest, and that leather briefcase nobody knew what was inside. The guards at the door let him through because Luciano had given specific orders. Let him in. Don't touch him. Show him respect. But respect wasn't something everyone in that room was willing to give. Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner, the man who ran Murder Incorporated, watched Bumpy enter, and his face showed nothing but contempt. For men like Anastasia, born in Sicily and raised on the streets of Brooklyn, where the lines between Italians and everyone else were written in blood, the idea of negotiating with a black man as if he were an equal was an offense. Frank Costello, more political, smoother in his methods, at least maintained his composure. Meyer Lansky, the financial genius of the group, simply observed. Calculated, because Lansky understood something Anastasia didn't understand. Numbers don't lie, and Bumpy Johnson controlled the numbers in Harlem. Luciano stood up when Bumpy entered, a gesture of respect, an acknowledgement that this wasn't a subordinate, but someone you negotiate with as an equal. Mr. Johnson, thank you for coming. Bumpy didn't respond immediately. He walked to the table, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. He pulled back the chair that only the boss should occupy and sat down. He placed his briefcase on the table. He pulled out a cigar. He lit it. He took a long drag. And only then, after the smoke had risen toward the ceiling and the silence had become almost unbearable, did he speak. Mr. Luciano, you wanted to talk. So talk. Luciano smiled, a thin smile, because he recognized what Bumpy was doing. He was establishing the terms before the conversation even began. He was demonstrating that he wasn't afraid, that he wasn't here as a guest, but as an equal, that he understood power didn't flow from the barrel of a gun, but from the willingness to walk away from a bad deal. Luciano sat across from him. He folded his hands on the table. His voice was calm, measured. The voice of a man who had negotiated with presidents and killers and knew the difference between the two. The voice of a man who had built an empire not just through violence, but through understanding that in the end, everything was business. I'm leaving the country in 3 weeks. The feds are deporting me to Italy. But before I leave, I need to make sure New York stays in order. No wars, no chaos, just business. The 5 families are set. Everything's in place, except for one thing. Bumpy nodded slowly, said nothing. He knew the value of silence, knew that sometimes the best negotiating tactic was to let the other man fill the void with words, with offers, with concessions they hadn't planned to make. Harlem's the last piece of the puzzle, Luciano continued. The numbers racket is generating millions. 5, 6, maybe 8 million a year depending on who's counting. My people want in, not because we need the money, we got plenty of money, but because control of New York means control of everything, and Harlem's the only territory we don't have a piece of. He paused, looked around the room. At Costello, who had the politicians. At Lansky, who had the banks. At Anastasia, who had the muscle. Then back at Bumpy. But I know you've been running things since Schultz died. You've got the trust of the community. You've got the infrastructure. Every cop from the 28th precinct to the 32nd is on your payroll. You've got judges, councilmen, you've even got a state senator who owes you favors. That's not the kind of operation you build overnight. That's generational work. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping, becoming more intimate, more sincere. I'm not here to take what's yours, Bumpy. I'm here to offer you a partnership. You keep running Harlem. Day-to-day operations stay exactly as they are. We provide protection from the feds, investment capital when you need to expand, and connections to our banking operations in Vegas and Havana when winners need to be paid in clean money. In return, we take 40% of the profits. You stay independent, but under our umbrella, under our protection. Nobody touches you. Nobody touches your people. You got the full weight of the 5 families backing you. The room went silent. Costello leaned forward, watching Bumpy's reaction like a hawk watching prey. Lansky's fingers drummed softly on the table, his mathematical mind already calculating profit margins, risk assessments, long-term growth potential. Anastasia cracked his knuckles, a sound like small caliber gunshots in the quiet room. And it was in that moment, in that charged silence, when one of Anastasia's bodyguards, a guy with scars and no brains, looked at Bumpy and spat out that word, nigger. As if that single word was enough to remind Bumpy Johnson of his place in the world. As if that word could cancel everything he'd built. As if that word was a weapon. But Bumpy Johnson had spent his entire life becoming immune to that kind of weapon. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't show rage. He simply opened his briefcase with an almost meditative calm, pulled out a photograph, and slid it across the table toward Luciano. Luciano picked it up. His face didn't change, but his fingers tightened around the edges. The photograph showed a warehouse in Red Hook, Brooklyn, one of Anastasia's gambling operations. And standing in front of it, shaking hands with a known police captain, was Albert Anastasia himself. That was taken 3 days ago, Bumpy said quietly. I've got 12 more just like it. Different warehouses, different cops, different members of your organization. The room went deadly silent. Costello's hand moved toward his jacket. Anastasia half rose from his chair. But Luciano just stared at the photograph, and then at Bumpy. And that's when Bumpy said the 9 words that would change everything. That word just cost you boys a fortune. Luciano frowned. I don't follow. Bumpy took another drag from his cigar. Let the silence do the heavy lifting. Then he leaned forward. You came to Harlem asking for a partnership. But a partnership means equals, and what you just offered wasn't a partnership. It was a takeover with a smile. He pointed toward the window, toward the lights uptown. You want what Schultz wanted. Control. But you can't have it. Not because you're not smart enough. Not because you're not strong enough. Because Harlem isn't yours to control. He paused. Let his words sink in. Schultz failed because he thought black folks were stupid. Thought we'd just hand over our money and say thank you. Thought brute force was enough. But Harlem doesn't work that way. You need trust. You need respect. You need to be one of us. And you'll never be one of us. Costello started to speak, but Luciano silenced him with a look. Bumpy continued, his voice dropping an octave. But here's what I will do. You asked for 40%. You can have 10. 10% of the profits, not as protection money, as a service fee. You provide banking support. We need clean money to pay winners when the big numbers hit. You provide legal help when our runners get arrested. In return, you get 10% of the net. He leaned back. And one more thing. You never, and I mean never, send your people into Harlem to collect. You want your money. You send a courier to my office. I'll have it counted, wrapped, and ready. But your soldiers don't patrol my streets. Your guns don't show up in my neighborhood. Harlem stays black. Harlem stays mine. That's the deal. The silence that followed was absolute. Meyer Lansky broke it first. He turned to Luciano. Charlie, that's actually a smart play. 10% for essentially no risk, no overhead, no exposure. It's clean money. Anastasia wasn't convinced. And what stops him from cutting us out once we set up the banking? Bumpy answered before Luciano could. The same thing that stops you from trying to take Harlem by force. A stalemate. You try to cheat me. Those photographs go public and your political protection evaporates. I try to cheat you. You come after me with everything you've got. We both lose, or we both get rich. Your choice. Lucky Luciano stared at Bumpy Johnson for what felt like an eternity. Then slowly, he started to laugh. Not a mocking laugh, a genuine one. You know what, Bumpy? Schultz was an idiot. Should have talked to you first. He stood up, extended his hand. 10%. Banking and legal support. No soldiers in Harlem, and you deliver the money monthly. Bumpy stood, shook his hand. One firm grip. We have a deal. Costello exhaled. Lansky smiled. Even Anastasia sat back down, the tension bleeding out of the room. Luciano held on to Bumpy's hand for an extra second. Let me tell you something, Bumpy. I've done business with presidents, cops, union bosses, killers. But you're the first man who came to my table and told me no without pulling a gun. That takes guts. Or stupidity. I haven't decided which yet. Bumpy smiled. A rare, genuine smile. When you figure it out, let me know. And then he looked at the bodyguard who had called him that word, the Sicilian with the scar across his throat. And Bumpy's smile disappeared. As for that word your boy used, he pointed at the photograph. That word just cost you 30% in profits. Because if your people can't show basic respect in a negotiation, I don't trust they can show respect in business. So it's 10%. Or it's war. And believe me when I tell you this, you might win that war, but it'll cost you more than Harlem's worth. He paused. Let the weight of his words settle. Because I don't fight like Schultz. I don't go to the streets with guns. I destroy you from the inside. With information, with cops, with prosecutors, with newspapers. And by the time you realize what happened, your empire will be in ashes. 3 weeks later, Lucky Luciano boarded a ship to Italy. He never returned to American soil. But the deal he made with Bumpy Johnson held for the next 22 years. The numbers racket flourished. Bumpy paid the 10% like clockwork. The Italians provided banking through legitimate fronts. When Bumpy got arrested in 1951 and sent to Alcatraz, Frank Costello personally made sure his family was taken care of. And when Bumpy walked out of prison in 1963, the deal was still intact. That meeting at the Stork Club became legend in organized crime circles. Not because of violence, not because of threats, but because two men from completely different worlds sat down and found a way to do business without destroying each other. Luciano would later tell associates in Italy that Bumpy Johnson was the smartest gangster he'd ever met, and the most dangerous. Because he didn't need them to respect him. He demanded it. Bumpy never talked publicly about the meeting, but people close to him said he kept that photograph of Anastasia in his office for the rest of his life. Not as a threat, as a reminder. Power isn't about who's willing to pull the trigger first. It's about who's smart enough not to have to. And sometimes, a single word can cost you millions. But the right response can earn you an empire.